The Olympics. A riveting event where nations have their best athletes face head to head. A place on the podium brings glory to you and your nation. However, these glorious events are certainly not without their controversies, but perhaps none as controversial as the 1904 Summer Olympics. The 1904 Summer Olympics took place in St. Louis, Missouri. It was the first ever Olympics to be held in the US and the first to be held outside of Europe. While the event was hosted in St. Louis, it was actually supposed to be held in Chicago, Illinois. After all, they had won the bid to host the event. However, St. Louis UC was hosting the World's Fair that year, and the people in charge of the event had realized that if another international event were to occur within the same time frame, there would be a huge contest for spectators. And it didn't help the host of the World's Fair. Chicago was the more well-known city of America's Midwest, as well as easier to get to. If St. Louis was a Golden Globe, then Chicago was an Emmy. If St. Louis was a shiny piece of silver, then Chicago was a shiny piece of gold. If Chicago was the family dog, and St. Louis was a kid. Always second best. The hosts of the World Fair knew that they would have to play dirty. They announced the World's Fair would host its own athletic events and partnered up with the Amateur Athletic Union, or AAU for short. This would not only make an event that would rival the Olympics, but decrease the number of possible contestants for Olympics, since the AAU would only be able to compete in St. Louis. It didn't take long for people to realize that there was no reason to have two major events in two different cities within the same year. The founder of the modern Olympics, Pierre de Coubertin, had to step in as a result and give the games to St. Louis instead. The Olympics at the time were not really meant to be a competition amongst countries, but rather amateur athletes around the world. As a result, athletes had to use their own expenses to travel to the competitions. Since air travel was expensive at the time, and St. Louis was a difficult place to travel to, coupled with tensions caused by the Russo-Japanese War, there were few athletes, let alone professional ones, from other nations to actually show up to the events. In the end, only 12 nations ended up participating compared to 26 that competed in the previous event. Out of the 651 participants, a whopping 526 participants were representing the US. That's approximately 81% of all participants. While the 1904 Olympics was a shit show, there are some neat things that I'd like to mention before we move on. The 1904 Olympics were actually the first Olympics to introduce the Olympic medals that we know and love. The events of boxing, dumbbells, freestyle wrestling, and decathlon all made their debuts there. Tug-of-war was part of the games as it was a popular event of the Summer Games from 1900 to 1920. There was a German-American gymnast, George Acer, who managed to win 6 medals despite having a wooden leg. It was the first time an African-American athlete, George Coleman Poige, won a medal. A German-American, Frank Kugler, won 4 medals in the events of freestyle wrestling, weightlifting, and tug-of-war, making him the only athlete to win a medal in 3 different sports in the same Olympics. Now let's get on with the show. In the 50-meter freestyle, Hungary's Zoltán Halmay is said to have beat American swimmer J. Scott Leary by 1 foot. The American judge, however, ruled that Leary had won instead. This is bullshit. I clearly made it to the end first. Maybe in Hungary you did, buddy. This is America. You Americans truly are just a bunch of bullies, with all your imperialism and warmongering. Yeah, and it's because of that warmongering that we're gonna kick your ass in World War I. World War what? How about we see who kicks whose ass here and now? Ah! The 2 swimmers then ended up fighting. As a result, the judges had to declare the first race a dead heat and order a rematch, in which after 2 false starts, Halmay won. The boxing match had a man named James Bollinger, who entered under an alias Carol Byrne, the name of a popular local boxer. He thought doing this would make the judges favor him more. Despite winning in the first round, he was promptly disqualified after it was discovered he was using an alias. Okay, now sit down and grab a bucket of popcorn for one of the most controversial events, the 1904 Olympic Marathon. The event starts off with a big problem right away. Very few of the runners participating were actual marathon runners. Rather, a majority of the runners had been middle distance runners, and the rest were people with practically no experience at all. These people included, but were not limited to, American Fred Lors, a bricklayer who had qualified through a special race, Felix Carvajal, a Cuban mailman, and Len Tonyane and Jan Mashiani from the South Africa's Tswana tribe, who were in town for their country's World's Fair exhibit. The marathon took place on a hot, humid day with temperatures in the high 90s, 32.2 and higher for those outside of the States. The track was 24.85 miles, or 40 kilometers, slightly shorter than a modern Olympic marathon, but consisted of roads inch deep in dust, 7 hills from 100 to 300 foot, or approximately 30.5 meters to 91.5 meters, some of which were very steep. Much of the track had cracked stone across the road, making for terrible footing, and the contestants would have to dodge cross-town traffic of delivery wagons, trains, trolley cars, and civilians. The entire marathon only had 2 water stations, a water tower 6 miles in, and a roadside well 12 miles in. The person who organized the events, James Edward Sullivan, wanted to test the limits and effects of purposeful dehydration, which was apparently common research at the time. So what is purposeful dehydration? Purposeful dehydration is the idea that drinking or eating while one is exercising would only upset one's stomach. Making it bad for one's performance. There were cars which were carrying coaches as well as physicians traveling alongside the runners, which would end up kicking up a lot of dust.
Hey, don't you think it's a bad idea to have cars driving in front of us on this dusty road? Won't they kick up a lot of dust, and won't we be breathing it in? Then, what if we end up breathing so much dust that it ends up coating our esophagus and ripping out our stomach lining, resulting in hemorrhaging? Nerd.
That is exactly what happened to one runner, William Garcia of California, who near mile 19 ended up coughing blood and then passing out on the side of the road. Had he not been discovered and gotten treated for an extra hour, it was said it was very likely that he would have bled to death. Another contestant, John Lorden, ended up suffering a bout of vomiting, probably due to all the dust, but who knows, and dropped out of the race as well. Hey, and remember Len Tonyane, one of the Sawana tribe guys? He ended up getting chased a mile off course by wild dogs, but he still managed to finish 9th after that. Nice. Contestant Felix Carvajal apparently was doing really well for himself, even though he was seen stopping a lot just so he could talk to spectators. In one occasion, he even stopped in front of a car where he saw some passengers eating peaches and asked for one. When they refused, however, he ended up playfully snatching 2 of them and ate them as he ran. Okay, I find it funny that it's referenced that he playfully snatched the peaches. Don't get me wrong, it's not like I would have thought he held them up at gunpoint and then was like, I tried asking nicely for some peaches, but now you forced my hand. It's not like peaches are that valuable. But if someone came up to me when I was eating some peaches and I said no, I sure as hell wouldn't be happy if they just took them away. Later on in the course, he also stops at an orchard so that he could snack on some apples. Now at this point, you're probably wondering, gee, this guy sure likes to snack a lot when he runs. However, it is speculated that he might have actually done this because he was dehydrated like the other contestants. Felix ends up getting stomach cramps. Some reports say this is due to the fact that apples were rotten. So what is Felix's bright idea to do with this? You'll never guess it. He decides to take a nap. In the middle of a marathon! What a Giga Chad. Hey, and despite all this, Felix still manages to finish 4th. Goddamn! Now, if all this didn't make you a Felix fan, let me mention that he raised the money to make it to St. Louis by running throughout Cuba, showing off his skill to the people. When he made it to New Orleans, he proceeded to lose all his money in a dice game, forcing him to hitchhike and walk to St. Louis. When he made it to the race, he was wearing a long-sleeved shirt, long pants, a beret, street shoes, very unconventional and probably uncomfortable for the marathon. A fellow Olympian ended up taking pity on him and cut his pants at the knees with a pair of scissors they found. Man, had Felix won, they'd probably be able to make a movie about him. Okay now, Samuel Meller, a favorite to win due to his victory in the Boston Marathon and Pan American Exposition Marathon, also ended up suffering severe cramps causing him to slow down to walking pace initially around mile 16, until eventually he too had to just drop out of the race. Hey, and look, it's Frederick Lors, the bricklayer, who also gets plagued by cramps around the 9-mile mark. Man alive, everyone's getting a cramp. Hell, I'm about to get a second-hand cramp just from hearing the word cramp so much. Anyway, Frederick decides to drop out and hitch a ride in one of the following cars, waving at spectators and runners alike as he passed them. 11 miles into the car ride, some sources say the car began to overheat. At the same time, Frederick had recovered from his cramps. So guess what? He decides it's a good idea to up and rejoin the race. This is what I like to call a pro gamer move. The handler of Thomas Hicks, one of the runners, saw this and demanded he get off the course. Frederick chose to ignore this and kept running instead. Hey, get off the course! You've already been disqualified! I can't hear you over the sound of me winning! Frederick ended up finishing the race a bit under 3 hours. When he got to the finish line, people cheered and howled about how American won. Considering there are only 4 nations participating, with 23 out of 32 runners being American, I wouldn't have been that shocked. Anyway, Alice Roosevelt, the 20-year-old daughter of President Theodore Roosevelt, was just about to place a gold medal around his neck when someone reported that the ceremony had to be stopped since Frederick was being charged of being an imposter. The great cheers quickly turned to boos. Boo! Then Frederick, being the genius that he was, came with the only excuse that he could think of. It's just a joke. But I guess some people just can't appreciate a good joke, since he proceeded to receive a lifetime ban from all future amateur contests. However, clearly they didn't mean his lifetime, but rather the lifetime of an average black rat for the rat move he pulled, since he would end up not only joining, but winning the Boston Marathon the following year. Okay now, let's talk about Thomas Hicks, another American favorite, and the person who would end up leading the marathon after the first mile. Even though he would keep this lead, if we exclude the cheater Frederick, he, like many others throughout this race, would run into trouble. When he arrived at the 10-mile mark, Thomas became really dehydrated, so much so that he would come under the support of a 2-man support crew. Far after passing the second water station, Thomas would go extremely thirsty once again. This time, his support crew would not be enough, as he would end up begging his crew for some water. Nowadays, people would be like, "Oh my god, get this poor man some water! He's running a goddamn marathon!" But remember, this is the time where some people thought purposeful dehydration was a good thing. So instead, they opted to sponge his mouth with some warm distilled water as a compromise. Man, if I was this guy, I doubt my own mother could stop me from grabbing that sponge out of their hands and just wringing all that water into my mouth. Around the 18-mile mark, Thomas once again could not take it anymore, and this time he needed more. This time around, his crew gave him a cocktail of egg whites with strychnine. Now, you know what strychnine is? I'll tell you. Strychnine is a white, odorless, and bitter crystalline powder. It is highly toxic and is often used as a form of pesticide for small vertebrates such as birds and rodents. Now, many of you may be asking, wow, if strychnine is so dangerous, why would you give this to your athlete? Well, that's because in small doses, it wasn't dangerous. In fact, in small doses, it acted as a stimulant. Now, you're probably like, a stimulant? But wait, isn't that cheating? And the answer is no. At least, not at the time anyway, as there were no rules about performance-enhancing drugs at the time. Anyway, this became the earliest recorded instance of someone using a performance-enhancing drug in the modern Olympics. So, yay, go America! Now, with the concoction coursing through his blood, Thomas was ready to go, except, remember him? Yeah, it's Frederick. And guess what? He just raced ahead of you, even though he had been disqualified. Tired, thirsty, worried, Thomas trudged on as his body grew more and more weary. Oh wait, what's that whistling in the wind? It's news that Frederick has been disqualified. It looks like Thomas's worries were unwarranted. Hey look, it's time for Thomas's third wind. Another round of soaking with sponges, and a second dose of strychnine and egg whites. Hey, and this time, let's chase it down with some brandy. And vroom! There he goes. It was written by a race official, Charles Lucas, that over the last 2 miles of the road, Hicks was running mechanically, like a well-oiled piece of machinery. His eyes were dull, lusterless. The ashen color of his face and skin had deepened. His arms appeared as weights, well tied down. He could scarcely lift his legs, while his knees were almost stiffed. Down to the last mile, Thomas began to hallucinate. He believed that the finish line was still 20 miles away. He also began begging for something to eat and to lie down. Man, honestly at this point, feels like they're just torturing this man over here. Thomas was then given some more brandy and 2 egg whites. He walked up to the last 2 hills, jogging down the inclines. Finally, the moment had come. He entered the stadium, and as he was closing in on the finish line, his crew would have to carry him over while he shuffled his feet. Hey, look at this, Thomas. You're the winner! Thomas ended up finishing up the marathon with a time of 3 hours and 28 minutes, the slowest time in an Olympic marathon by a margin of 30 minutes. Thomas would then proceed to be taken care of by 4 doctors over a course of an hour, just so that he could become well enough to leave the area. He had lost a whopping 8 to 10 pounds over the course of the race, or 3.6 to 4.5 kilograms. In the end, out of the 32 competitors in the marathon, only 14 would end up finishing. The 1904 Olympics would end up being one of the longest events, lasting for almost 5 months in comparison to modern Olympics, only lasting a bit over 2 weeks. This is due to the fact that even though a majority of the track and field events were held within the time frame of August 29th to September 3rd, the other events were scattered throughout several months, so they could be done in tandem with the World's Fair sports events. Now for an honorable mention. Anthropology Days. Ever since the 1889 World's Fair in Paris, human zoos... Wait, am I reading that right? Yep. Human zoos were a key feature of World's Fairs. They served as demonstrations of anthropological notions of race, progress, and civilization. Or in other words, for Caucasians to look at people from other parts of the world and think about how backwards and savage they were. The 1904 World's Fair obviously had to keep up with tradition, hosting these human zoos as an event called Anthropology Days on the days of August 12th and 13th. About 1,400 indigenous people from Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, East Asia, Africa, the Middle East, South America, and North America were displayed in exhibits to show them in their natural habitats. Hey, but you know what's more interesting than watching strange people from strange cultures doing their common household activities? Them competing in sports that they've never played and demeaning activities for your enjoyment. As such, the organizers set up a sporting event where indigenous people were paid to compete in traditional Olympic events and events deemed more suited for these people, such as mud throwing. Now, the organizers claimed that these events were supposed to show indigenous people's natural athletic abilities. Though, the lack of instruction to the participants and their overall poor performance makes it a bit doubtful. A newspaper, Louise Post-Dispatch, was crasser about what they thought of the event, with an excerpt titled, "Barbarians Meet in Athletic Games." It's also important to note that the organizer, James Edward Sullivan, yes, the same James Edward Sullivan who was mentioned for believing in purposeful dehydration in a later marathon, would end up concluding that the event was proof that the savage had been very much overrated from an athletic point of view. Even though Pierre de Coubertin, the guy who founded the modern Olympics, didn't make it to the event, he pointed out how he disapproved of the whole thing by saying, "As for that outrageous charade, it will of course lose its appeal when black men, red men, and yellow men learn to run, jump, and throw, and leave the white man behind them.